Commission, and who is based in Chile. So we're going to have a panel speak for about 40 minutes or something between you, and then we'll have a change. We had wanted breakout groups, but it's not possible in the room, so we will have 3 topics. The first topic is public services. The second topic is multidimensional poverty and inequalities. And the third topic is the social dimension, in social issues, including social protection and care economy. And for that, we will have myself and others on the panel, and plus others in the room, sitting to introduce these issues and to receive your comments, the call for action to go to the summit. And if you haven't read the modalities resolution of the summit, I do encourage you to read it. It's on the website. The modalities resolution of the summit specifically states that the people who will be allowed to go to the summit have to be approved through a process of which we know has been difficult here, and it's carrying on into the summit. So we have to think carefully about our strategy towards the summit, both in terms of content, attendance, participation in, and substance. So I'm going to hand over to Ingo, because GCAP has prioritized the work around the social summit, and I want to hand over to you so that you can tell us why. Thank you, Ingo.
Thank you, Sylvia. It seems like there's a lot of interest in the World Social Summit. That's good, because somehow it was quite unclear until recently, and maybe still not fully clear, but I think the topics, the different social topics, and Sylvia already mentioned, part of them are definitely fundamental. So basically, for us, the hope was or is to make this a really big, important event where governments are held accountable for their how to say, inactivities, for example, on social protection, also health, education, other parts like decent work, and so on. So we hope to have this real milestone. My dream is a bit like a social COP, like the climate COP. Of course, the financing for development for conference next year is very much connected. So we just heard in the last panel about the relationships, like for example, Bhumika at the end explained that very well. So I think we should really think this together, the structural causes of inequalities and also for the missing financing. So that I think that was a problem already, for example, 2015 with the Addis Ababa conference, and then the SDGs, where there was this lack of connection. So definitely we should avoid this. So for us, these 2 conferences or summits are actually interconnected. So just a bit on the background, I was requested to introduce. So this World Social Summit is also basically proposed by the Secretary General in our common agenda. For a long time, it was unclear when it will happen. So finally, there was a resolution in the General Assembly end of February this year. Basically, it was decided to call it second World Summit for Social Development, but usually we say World Social Summit. So it will be from 4th to 6th November 2025 in Qatar. So afterwards, 2 co-facilitators were appointed, Morocco and Belgium. They started then to prepare the modalities resolution, which Silvia already mentioned. So there was a process as it is, like there was a zero draft beginning of May. We started to work on it already with colleagues in Nairobi, with a major group of children and youth, and then also with the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, NGCAP. We wrote actually a letter to the co-facilitators. We wanted to discuss with them on the modalities resolution before it was finalized. We didn't get an answer, so we hope with the Summit of the Future is over, that afterwards there's a chance to have this dialogue, how civil society can be included in a meaningful way, a much better way than for the Summit of the Future or the Pact for the Future. So basically the modalities resolution was finalized mid-July, and there's very little, if not nothing, on the process. It is written, ECOSOC registered organizations can participate, others have to be approved, but there's nothing about major groups and other stakeholders. There's nothing on the process of civil society participation. So we really need to work on it. And therefore, I'm also looking forward to this panel. So also, it is mentioned that there should be a political declaration, which should be agreed basically before the summit. So yeah, I think we need really to work on this latest with in the Commission for Social Development in February. This process will start, but we need to work already now on the preparations, on what we want, and we as the Global Call to Action Against Poverty are really committed also to work on it in the capitals, in the countries around the world, because I think that's really crucial, not only here in New York, but to work at national level. And finally, also we are committed to mobilize, as we have seen in the last panel on financing for development and the international financial architecture. So we really think we should mobilize and bring this together, the social and climate part with the financing part, and to bring this together in a mobilization. So for that, we have also the planning tomorrow afternoon, and we invite all of you to participate in this planning session. That much as an introduction, and I'm really looking forward to this panel.
Thank you very much, Ingo. As the outcomes of the Summit of the Future will provide an important foundation for the next year's World Summit for the social development, it's intended to address the gaps in social development and recommit to the principles outlined in the 1995 Copenhagen Declaration, and give momentum towards the implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Importantly, this agenda seeks to place people and the economy at the center of sustainable development and calls for the eradication of poverty, promotion of full and producive employment, and inclusive social integration to achieve stable, safe, and just societies for all. As an outcome of the UN Civil Society Conference in 2024, MJCY, GCAP, and other partners convened a civil society working group towards the World Social Summit, putting people at the heart of social development, which has now transformed into an open space and engagement group for a growing contourism of partners and right holders constituencies towards supporting meaningful youth and civil society engagement at the World Social Summit. I'd like to start by giving the floor to Barbara Adams. And Barbara, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about the spirit, aftermaths, and the challenges of the Copenhagen Summit and the world's current context. Thank you.
Wow. So, for those of you who don't know, Copenhagen's 30 years ago. The Copenhagen conference and the processes leading up to it, and I will emphasize repeatedly, the work leading up to it is the most important. The work leading up to it, we're in an era at the end of the Cold War. We have lots, first Cold War maybe, I don't know. I don't know why we call them cold. They're never cold, but never mind. And so there was, the period before was dominated by nuclear powers, basically two at that stage. And this was the era when we had the opportunity to address non-military threats to security. And that's UN speak for all of the things that you just mentioned, including many others. The other thing was we'd come off of a period of time when the World Bank had been pursuing what are called structural adjustment programs for countries that needed to borrow, and those are essentially austerity measures. Again, it wasn't like that, but that's what it boils down to. But the good thing about the process leading up to Copenhagen was we had what are called preparatory committee meetings. And civil society came to those meetings, and it provided the preparatory process for us to really do our work. We don't have that this time, but the good thing is it's more than a year away. So watch out, there's plenty of work that needs to be done. The other thing that happened in Copenhagen and around it was when the women's major group essentially got going. The major groups have never been dedicated specifically, depending on the groups and organizing, and that has become a very dynamic and vibrant group. We're now in a different era. Now we have rampant violence, genocide, multidimensional violence. Warfare today is not dominated by nuclear weapons or the deterrent. Warfare today also includes cyber warfare, it includes trade warfare, it includes weaponizing migrants. We're in a very different time. The Copenhagen conference was successful, the summit was successful in really making a priority focus on the public sector. There were three main things: the government, the market forces, I don't like to call it the private sector because small and medium, they're so different, but that's the formal characterization, and the public sector. We are now today in a situation where the public sector, frankly, has been completely undermined by policies, both domestic and international, and a whole slew of different treaties in world trade, TRIPS. We've all been through COVID. We know the limitations, and there certainly isn't enough time for me to depress you all with a nice long list of them. But it's not just about the lack of the content, the quantity of public finance. The quality of public finance today is also, in many cases, really, really low. A lot of public resources are being used to incentivize big corporations to be able to take up lion's shares in the delivery of education services, health services, water, etc., etc. And as we're all very aware, they're also being used to now favor war and instruments of war over peace, sustainable development, etc. One of the things that I'm really pleased that there are some panelists with me that I think might address this. The essence of what we're talking about is rights. We're talking about people's rights. We're talking about discrimination across a whole range of areas, but basically because the actual structure of the way society goes about at the moment is the problem. But you don't get your rights as a market commodity. And so I think this particular process we're involved in is an incredibly valuable opportunity to really challenge the current ways in which policies are shaped, dominated by the economic sector. This is not only a domestic responsibility. We know the social compact, a contract is broken in many countries or didn't exist at a national domestic level, but it's also blind to the cross-border issues and the unwillingness to tackle things like, and if you were at the last panel, I think you heard, tackle issues like tax evasion, tackle issues like the way in which we have massive debt creation going on now. And you have a situation where many, many countries are spending more on servicing their debt outside their domestic borders and spending more on that than on the provision of health and education and so on. it's very clear that for us to address the social, the issues of the summit, we've also got to really, really redo this whole approach to the role of the public sector and public finance. We talk a lot about the need for inclusion. Frankly, inclusion into what? What's happening now? Do we really want to be included in this? I think we have to flip the language and we have to talk about exclusion. We have to talk about the drivers of exclusion, and we have to be committed to tackling those issues, to deal with sectors of society, people that are excluded. We talk about poverty, absolutely. But we also need to look at inequalities. The inequalities, particularly income and wealth inequalities and non-income, that sort of academic word for covering discrimination against women, indigenous people, etc., etc. These are basically the major issues. If we talk only about poverty, we're allowing ourselves to support policies that raise the income only, frankly, of the bottom percentage, very likely at the expense of the middle band, not the top. Because we don't talk about inequalities. We don't talk about wealth inequalities. We're having a huge fight here just to even be able to put that on as a tax item. I think we all know, we've heard repeatedly things like the 10 wealthiest billionaires or the 10 wealthiest people, because they're more than billionaires, have more wealth than the total of the world's poorest 40%. Where are the policies to address that? Where's the mobilization? Which institutions have even a mandate and are accountable to people to do it? We hear quite often what we need is political will. We have political will, not ours. We don't have these policies by accident. Big corporations spend more lobbying to make sure that it's deregulation. These are all part of the drivers of exclusion that I think this meeting that we're talking about and the lead up to it should be about. One more thing that I'd like to put on the agenda that I think is really crucial is the way we actually even measure progress. The way we measure progress at the moment is with this thing called gross domestic product or gross national income. It's more or less the same thing. And it's used as the way to measure progress across a whole range of areas, and it shapes and determines policy. And it says who's wealthy, who's doing well, which economies are more successful than others. What does GDP do? It completely invisibilizes, because it doesn't count, unpaid care work. It doesn't look at injustices within the household. It's biased against the informal economy, and the informal economy in many countries is where most of the employment is located, completely missing. It even discriminates against the public sector and public finance in a whole range of different areas. It favors highly paid CSOs because GDP is just an aggregate. You add up all of the payment that goes for economic activity. So it rewards cutting down trees because you employ people. It doesn't reward keeping oil in the ground. It doesn't reward not having the crisis. So GDP is that it's a metric that not only is unhelpful, frankly, from my point of view, it's actually part of the problem. Because if you look at program after program, people are more successful, countries are successful, policies are successful if GDP goes up. GDP, well, you've heard me. You know, I've got an obsession about GDP. Okay, so I don't know how many of you have read the Pact for the Future. I've read the 5 versions. In fact, there's somebody sitting in the room, I saw her just now, who's done absolutely brilliant side-by-side of the versions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in terms of how the language changed and deteriorated in many areas. But there you go, that's the way things are. Well, they're not, but that's a longer story. In the Pact for the Future, there is Action 53. Quote, we will develop a framework on measures of progress on sustainable development to complement and go beyond gross domestic product. It's on the agenda. We have been fighting. Statisticians have been working on this for ages. It's not a technical issue, it's a political issue. And if there isn't a decision at the heads of state level to not use it the way it's used, it will continue, despite all of the work that we're doing. This summit, I actually don't call it the World Social Summit. That sounds like we're just going to have a big party. I do call it the World Summit on Social Development, the second one. It's well timed in some ways. And I've got a couple of things. The language in the pact is sparse, which frankly I think is good, because I think the pact could be very dangerous if it closes off options. But again, that's also another conversation. But it does actually want an ambitious outcome from that meeting. And I think it's really important that we're the ones who have to be ambitious. We won't get an ambitious outcome if we are not ambitious. We won't get an ambitious outcome if we don't really start working in advance before negotiations start at national levels to make sure that we get across what we want out of this meeting, that we engage with our government representatives where we feel represented, where we have agency. And I think that also, we have to also involve parliaments. Most of the work that takes place here is the executive branch of government. The executive branch of government is not that transparent in most countries. So I think that there's plenty of time. There's a huge agenda. You'll hear everybody's got something they want on this. That's part of what I wish you all good luck in sorting out. One thing I'd like to add, we don't have a global body, a governance body anywhere whose job is to expose and reduce inequalities. It doesn't exist. I wouldn't want to put such an institution in place if we don't do the other work, because we can predict if you don't change the dynamics and the positions and the accountability, you can do as much reform and institutions as you like. If the positions that go in don't change, the outcome won't change. But if we feel we're really getting some momentum here, we need a space where we can hold governments in country and cross-border issues, tax evasion, et cetera, accountable, because a lot of the policies of the Bretton Woods institutions, et cetera, are actually driving inequalities, not the opposite. So I really like going first, because everybody else will cheer you up after I've done the other job.
Barbara, thank you very much for the valuable history and for highlighting points like the closing the gap between economic policy and rights, and where the money is being spent, and inequalities is getting beyond the GDP. And we as right holders should have the political will as the right holders. Moving on, I will head to Paul from the Inclusivity Project. Paul is also the organizing partner of the stakeholder group of communities discriminated against through work and dissent. And Paul, I would like to ask you to elaborate more on the left behind. Lessons until today and strategic approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami. Friends, I exactly don't want to talk about this left behind, because that's nothing is more farther than the truth that we are left behind. We are pushed out. No, we are pushed out, we are excluded, we are trampled, we are down, and we are hidden, and we are invisibilized. So to say us, just to ease your minds that these are left behind, let's do something about them. Let's give them some crumbs here. You know, they should have something on the table. They cannot have something on the table because they are only fit for the crumbs. Please, I think we should not use this word, left behind. We are pushed out, and it's not just at the time of World Social Summit or even, we're pushed out for intergenerationally, for no fault of ours. And therefore, sorry for this outburst. It's just an act, of course, but it is the truth, the anger, the hatred that is being created because of these words. And another most misused, abused word, I'm sorry to start with this, is social inclusion. Why? Because it's a facade. It's a deliberate facade that you use these words, but then you do whatever you want, because we say, wow, social inclusion, that Dalits may have been included already. Indigenous must have been included, or the racially discriminated communities would have been included, or the persons with disability, or LGBT. But then they say social inclusion, and we will build accessible infrastructure, period, nothing else. Or we'll have a anti-discrimination policy, nothing else. No budgets, not being unpacked with clear accountable measures, no transparency, and most of all others except us will be around the table, and we will be, as usual, part of the menu. We will not have an access to participate, of course, in panels like this. Yes, thank you. But then the participation element of the communities who have been intergenerationally discriminated and forced into slavery or slave-like forms, and then use, as Barbara has said, the cover of GDP, the cover of income. We will raise the income, but you will not address the exclusions, the cruelty, the murderous attempts on every day on youth, on the children, on the aged in our communities. So let me just rant a few more critical aspects that I think we need to really address. First, these red herrings, I call them as red herrings. What is the red herrings? We cannot use it as a facade anymore and then do exactly the opposite. Without, I think this is also what Barbara has just said, without analyzing the causes and the structural elements of exclusion, you cannot have any form of social development, even economic development, even SDGs or anything. Because why have you weaponized these immigrants? Who are these immigrants? These are not the rich from India, Morocco, Mali, Mauritania, or any of our other so-called third countries. The elite in my country are having a good time anyway. The African descent are not the wealthy African descents or socially elite African descents or Africans in their countries who are come here. No. It's the pre-colonial forms of slavery, my friends, that has existed in all these countries. And it is those people who have been excluded by their parent countries or whatever the mother countries. They are continuously trying to explore other opportunities, and they come here, they also are being excluded and also driven into extreme poverty, which I don't think they will ever come out again. So without analyzing the structural inequalities, we cannot have any declaration. So how do you look at this? I mean, I don't think this is really a mouthful word. We also have to get our word around. Maybe simply we will say descent communities, but it's not descent because all of us are descent from somewhere, for someone. But for technical usage, I think UN is beginning to use this word communities discriminated on work and descent, but we are calling it, we are also using the term, but we are fed up with this whole, like public works department or something like that, but we are calling ourselves descent communities, but we are Dalits, Haratin, Shambara, and several other communities from Africa, Roma, and previously we were derogatorily called as Gypsy, Sinti, and other names in Europe, Quilombola, Palenque, and other communities in Latin America. Now, we have been here almost longer than you. Don't think, these people have just come here and we are discovering them. No, we have been there. We have been invisibilized. We've been pushed into poverty, into slavery, modern forms of slavery, traditional forms of slavery, into all forms of trafficking. The children have been bonded, and we are intergenerationally excluded. So you discover them this side, and then again the next year, next decade, every social summit. But you will never find any clear policy or even a mention of these communities, including social summit. And that's why I'm here on the table now, not part of the menu, trying to say that let's stop this, because there are layers of exclusion, layers of pushing out that has been done. And now it's not rhetoric, but we'll have to very clearly say how these communities need to have. And I think, again, I'm repeating what Barbara has said, it cannot be on a charity mode. I think that's the worst form of respect that we extend to these communities. We don't need charity, because we are the ones who actually, sorry for using some of the foul languages, it'll come. We are the ones who created wealth for this world. It's because that our wages have been kept low. It's because that our land has been grabbed by you people. But it's because that our whole work has been completely trafficked and exploited, that you are able to have the wealth and the suits and dress like what I'm wearing. And then you are saying that you're going to give me as a crumb a social inclusion. No, we are fed up. We don't want it. We want rights. We want a rights-based ensuring that in this social inclusion, that it is built with a underpinning rights approach, so that it becomes an entitlement which leads to a right, but not just these aspects, but also make sure that it is completely underpinned with the necessary financial resources. So which means it must necessarily mean financial inclusion, ensuring that the budgets are allocated, and clear authority and ensuring mechanisms and administrative mechanisms are ensured, so that these are cleared. They told me just 10 more minutes, so I'll try to finish within 6 minutes. Sorry, I'll finish now. So friends, I think with these, one of the things, definitely we recommend social protection floors, very clear social protection floors. If you ensure that social protection floors start with the layer, recognize that there are layers of exclusion, and there are completely invisibilized communities in every society, which need to be put a priority while you build the social protection floors. Because if you don't do that, Barbara, this is where I disagree with you. You will have only the middle who are eating the resources of the most excluded. So you don't really, I don't support you. Sorry, I support you in every other way, but I don't support this thing that you start at the middle class. Maybe the middle class in your context, in my context, are very different, because the elite and the wealthy are the middle class in many of the societies, and the others are actually the most excluded or not even part of the economic radar. So social protection floors with clear accountability and transparent measures, financial inclusion, and ensure that it starts with the most excluded. Thank you very much. Jai Bhim, Opera Roma, Salve.
Thank you very much, Paul. You highlighted the importance of being part of the conversation, not part of the menu. That's what I agree with the most. And you also analyzed the structures of inequalities. So thank you very much for your speech. Next, we're going to hear from my dear friend Cecilia from NGO CSOC-D on the reflections of the modalities.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Cecilia Schurmeister, and I serve as chair of the World Social Summit Subcommittee for the NGOC SOCD. I want to thank both of the panelists that have already spoken. It's a hard act to follow, but I will do my best. Specifically for highlighting a lot of the assumptions that I think underlie how we have maybe thus far navigated the social development agenda, and I'm going to try and zoom out a little bit to think about some of these assumptions and some of the norms and maybe how we can adjust that going forward. So to start, I think we all can attest to the fact that it's quite significant that this meeting is happening while the Summit of the Future is happening. The Commission for Social Development will be in February. There's a lot of processes that are taking place, and I think it's important to find coherence between all of these. And much like the future-oriented spirit of the proceedings taking place now, maybe this meeting and maybe our next efforts can really take the form of imagination, of envisioning what we want this World Social Summit to achieve, and what we want the future to look like. We have to really be in this mode of imagining to see something different than what the status quo offers us. In our common agenda, the Secretary General stated, now is the time to renew the social contract between governments and their societies so as to rebuild trust and embrace a comprehensive vision of human rights. And to me, this indicates something that we really have to be thinking about as a central element of our strategy, and that is how to establish the right relationship between people and the state. These questions were, of course, very much present in Copenhagen, and they found expression in the 1995 Copenhagen Declaration, which drew attention to a key reality of the contemporary world, that the roots of numerous global challenges lie in how human beings view, value, respond to, and relate to one another. So how can these ideas and the assumptions that inform them be captured in a new social contract? How can the relationships underlying the social fabric be strengthened? And how can such transformation assist a community to measurably improve its material and economic circumstance? So if we're thinking about transforming the relationship between people and the state, specifically with the goal of addressing the 10 commitments listed in the Copenhagen Declaration, I think we also need to contemplate more deeply the ways that we see this relationship now. So, for example, if we were to look at democracy, maybe we could benefit from a deeper exploration of what that really means. What does it mean when we talk about democracy? And I think now, very often, the term democracy just implies, not just, but it implies the presence of an election. If an election has taken place, we can somehow assume that it was fair and that the voices of people have been heard. Maybe that's the position that democracy has taken now. And a fair election almost becomes a box that needs to be ticked off. And of course, while fair elections are essential components of a healthy and functioning society, and they ideally ensure that the perspectives of the whole citizenry have been considered, framing a society as democratic simply based on the presence of an election risks diminishing the other elements integral to what might be envisioned to be a healthy relationship between the people and the state. What about democratic principles? What about the other principles and values that we would wish would animate a future society? What about gender equality? What about human rights? Addressing inequalities, solidarity. How can these be part of the conversation that is animating our forward efforts towards the World Social Summit? And I think that meaningful social development, it will ultimately require the cultivation of the qualities like trust, of trustworthiness, of cooperation, of mutual assistance for the collective well-being. And so I think a lot of these qualities are maybe ones that, to a certain extent, animate the motion that has been made, but also we maybe need to come back and look at those fresh and ask ourselves, is that really the direction that we're going in? Are we going to achieve those principles just based on what we currently see? Otherwise, we can fall prey to the majoritarian claims that are devoid of some of these transcendent values of humanity. So I think we have to go deeper in our calls and ensure that justice, which incorporates within it a concern for the well-being of humanity, is central in our discussions to this new social contract. Civil society can play a significant role in ensuring that these normative dimensions inform the creation of this new social contract. In terms of strategies, we know that civil society organizations play an indispensable role in ensuring health, education, employment, social protection, and countless other aspects of social development. And the work of civil society is critical to ensuring that global agendas reflect local aspirations, which of course must be at the heart of the social contract. So the NGO CSOC-D has put forward a statement, or they previously put forward a position paper that says that the elevation of human capacity lies at the heart of social development. And we know that a lot of the meat, of the nitty-gritty of community building, of the changing of the hearts and minds, of intergenerational solidarity, of decisions relating to institutions, the soil where the seeds are planted for change, a lot of that happens at the grassroots. And I think the civil society organizations are the ones that see that the best, and they're able to be this bridge between the grassroots and the multilateral level. And they're also able to see the conversations that are taking place at the grassroots and to assist or to see whether or not the conversations are also focused on the commitments that are listed in Copenhagen. So they have that very important role of connecting the dots in a sense. Otherwise, if we don't have this bridge, this communication channel, then a lot of the aspirations will just remain the aspirations. So I want to highlight the statement, Bridging Vision to Action, that the NGO CSOC-D put out. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And I think this document speaks to exactly that role that the civil society can play in bridging where we want to go from what we have done so far. So these opportunities for engagement enable us to, of course, review the progress that has been made, to think about the gaps in the limitations and the limitations in the implementation, but also to move forward in a way that is galvanized by an informed sense of hope and optimism. I think during these past couple of days, we've seen that despite the conditions of the world and despite the chaos and despite the inability to gain the access to these spaces, we will not be able to necessarily move forward if we're not operating on a sense of hope and conviction that ultimately this is going to lead to the future that we want to build. So I think that as we're thinking about the ways to strengthen a new social contract, and as we're thinking about our strategies for going into this World Social Summit, whether as members of NGOs, of governing institutions, people that are serving on agencies of the UN, I think we have to remember that we're all protagonists who inhabit this planet. We all have a role to play in bringing about this future, and each person has a role to play in thinking about the assumptions that motivate how we act and channeling that into our institutional presence as we go forward to the World Social Summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecilia. And next, we're moving on to Kostas to give us a little bit on the impact of populist narratives on the progress and sustainable development.
Hi, everyone. It sounds too theoretical. It won't be theoretical. I've just elaborated and reflect on that, trying to just make it more practical. So it's a pleasure to be here. Sylvia, thanks for making this happen. So it's wonderful to be given this step and share some of the thoughts and insights on projects we've been involved throughout the last. I've been involved in sustainability for more than 20 years. I've been researching and investigating together with my team populism and corporate sustainability for the last 4 years now. I'm lucky enough I don't represent only the University of Bath, so I'm an academic there, but as well, I'm a trustee at Zovu, which is a global platform intending to overcome the finance problem you are aware of, and that is of directly financing marginalized communities. So at Zovo, we try to solve out this problem and directly fund these communities, giving them voice and acknowledging their efforts to address aspects of SDGs. So I have two provocations. Probably you would like the first one. Not sure about the second one. The first one, is directly stems from populism. And over the last 3 days, I couldn't just but noticed the frequent use of the word people. So it's in the UN declaration, we the people. Leaders in the action days kept frequently referring to it. So we're saying that we put the people first, we want to address the people. And then yesterday, colleagues from CSOs as well did the same. It's a widely used phrase. But if we step back a bit, are we sure that we know who the people are? Because what we witnessed over the last 15, 20 years is a dramatic rise of politicians who they too refer to the people, but they do so in a different way. So they use the people as a means of integration and division at the same time. So they use that reference to promote themselves as representatives of the people, claiming that they promote and care for the people's will, whereas in reality what they do is that they care and promote their own aspirations, their own agendas. And it's funny because this reference to the people frequently gets specific attributes, so it has specific features. And these features are frequently racially informed and ethnically informed. Whoever doesn't fall into these characteristics immediately is not perceived as a member of the people. And I have a very personal example as well. If in the UK, I'm Greek, but I've been living in the UK. I'm a washed up Greek, as I like to say, because I've been living in the UK for ages now. But if I am to talk about the people to my neighbor living next door, will have a completely different view because she's a Brexiteer. She massively supported Brexit and she didn't want me to be there. So that version of who the people are and which our priorities are is completely blurred. So going back to these politicians, they use that notion to, as I said, promote their own agendas. They come out of the political fringes. They've acquired power into many parts of the world. They have been able to legitimize incomprehensible arguments which for years they shouldn't be, and they weren't just promoted, they weren't legitimized. They're able to do so. They're able to come up with narratives which are not, which are deeply problematic, which are discriminatory, xenophobic. They support economic growth instead of sustainable development. They support barriers to trade instead of international cooperation. And these people have quite a lot of publicity. They have attracted a crowd. So are we sure that we are on the same page where we're referring to the people? Because my understanding is that when we refer to the people, we don't include the voters of the Trumps of this world, the voters of the Mondis of this world, the voters of the Erdogans of this world. Sadly, the list is significant. The question is, we as CSOs, we understand the criticality of these challenges, but they don't. How can we then embrace these views if we want to embrace these views? Because if it is to move towards a sustainable future, we need to have these guys on board. Otherwise, we can't do it on our own. And if you pay attention, I've been entertaining this idea that it's an information-based problem. So these guys patiently have been managed to control and gain that crowd by having a very strong presence on media. They are allergic to democratic procedures, but they draw heavily on media to manipulate the message and present themselves as supporters of democracy. The first provocation thus is, why don't we do the same? Are we too civilized to just aggressively control that platform, that space? We have that understanding that wars are won on the streets. But more and more, wars are won in the cloud. So the first provocation to you is this: can we just do the same when we want to push forward and promote a meaningful agenda towards sustainable development goals, and in preparation for the summit, can we actually promote a similar approach, equally aggressive in that space? The second provocation comes from the private sector. And I told you, probably you won't like that. I've worked with the private sector for all my life. I used to be a consultant before becoming an academic. And I've always, despite the fact that I'm an adamant supporter of government intervention, I've always worked with the market, entertaining the idea of ethical capitalism. And I'm lucky enough, I'm directing a master's at Bath on sustainability and management. I'm lucky enough every year to welcome passionate students who want to make a change within the private sector. I won't lie, I have many defeats, mostly defeats. And just these defeats have always pushed me back, wondering whether this is a substantial thing or not. And it seems that it's mostly a reputational thing than anything else. But at the same time, more and more, I see just evidence of change. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So we have a project in France. The French state is not willing to regulate and protect women who've been sexually assaulted on the street. So instead, what the state is doing is that it passes on the responsibility to the councils, which in turn train small business owners to offer the private space as a refuge for women who've been sexually assaulted. So these guys, once they receive the training, they are willing to step in and open up their space, shut down their operations at an obvious expense, and offer refuge to these women. Are these part of the people as well that we want to work with? The second is even spicier. We have another project in Turkey, and there we have witnessed a more strategic kind of approach on behalf of the private sector. There we've witnessed liberal elites ignoring the issue of immigration, not willing to do anything. But when it comes to gender, they use gender strategically in collaboration with CSOs there to combat Erdogan's deeply conservative narrative. Are these elites members of the people we want to work with? And then another example in Saudi Arabia, again from another project, there we witness something else. There we witness what we expect. The private sector, big corps, the dirty, really evil guys of this world. They are in bed with the autocratic regime, but at the same time, in a very clandestine format, they collaborate with international CSOs to combat the official Saudi government. And thus, again, my provocation is, do we perceive these people as part of the people? Are we open enough, or are we willing to change the way we've been thinking and approaching things? The easiest thing is to blame corporations. Yeah, we know that. They are dirty. They are greedy. They will go for the profit. They have endless means of maximizing quite easily their profits. And most of them operate at a supernormal profit these days. So the overall and abrupt ending to that is whether we can level up our game, claim a space on the cloud to pass on a message, and try and form strategic partnerships with segments of the private sector in preparation for the Social Development Summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kostas, for this very insightful message. Last but not least, on this segment, let's move to Valentina to give us her input on the strategic pillars towards the World Social Summit. Valentina.
Hola a todas y todos. Thank you for coming here, for allocating our scarce time on a Monday morning to care for our future, our collective future. What I wanted to do today is actually to provocate a conversation on how we can use what is happening in the front, in the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future as a leverage for our discussions towards the World Summit. There we go. So why should we care about what's happening up front, right? We know, and many of us have different evaluations of what the summit and also the pact are actually on, and we we can have our critiques to both of them. But whatever our opinions are in that, the pact is there, and it actually includes a more representative input on what the reality is today. It rests to see what happened yesterday at the opening to see that that's the political situation today as well. I think it also references to topics that we didn't have before, like in that level of discussion. For example, technology, the inclusion of youth and future generations, the care and the enabling environment for domestic resource mobilization, among others, are included in the language of the pact. And also there's inadequately or insufficiently addressed in certain topics, such as the catalyzation of private investment, the inclusion of PPPs, taxation. It's not. Okay, thank you. That's better. Thank you so much. And the taxation of high net worth individuals in the appropriate fora and not within the UN necessarily. I think that's one of the challenges that lies ahead of us. And sadly, there's other topics that we are concerned about and that remain silent in the pact. For example, the inclusion of public services on how the economic, social, and cultural rights are actually delivered for people. So what I wanted to say today or catalyze the discussion about is how we can use this the pact as a step towards or to leverage that into a concrete opportunity to strategize and mobilize in 4 strategic pillars. The first one is about public services and technology. We will discuss together this later, but the absent, as I said, was the need for public services. They don't say public services, it's only just once, and it's like really washed out. They talk about basic services, essential services, digital public services, that's the one that it calls for, and the safe and secure data systems or services. But what this do is actually include a risk of privatization and or commercialization of these public goods. And that's something that needs to be addressed in the future. Other thing is weak language on the digital architecture and data, especially when it's public. So it talks about best practices, the promotion of in the Global Digital Compact. So we need to have private accountability and protection for this to be really public goods, as the pact says, right? A second pillar is poverty and inequalities. We will discuss this as well afterwards. But one thing is, maybe it's just like wishful language, but there's the recognition that poverty is still the greatest global challenge that we face. We can work with that. And it calls for measures to eradicate multidimensional nature of poverty. So we need to be addressing all these elements towards working to eradicate it. One thing that it really called my attention is that it committed not to only actions to get out of poverty, but also to prevent falling back, which I think I haven't seen it before in this kind of document. And it also includes a promotion of social rights generally. We can discuss if they're enough or not, but universal health coverage, quality, inclusive education is there, decent work for all, and universal access to social protection, only access to social protection. So yeah, we need to work on those. And finally, close the gender gap, acknowledging that most of the time poverty has women's face. Then another thing that is important and maybe risky in the future is the inclusion of science and technology in fighting poverty. That could be good, that could be bad, we don't know, but still we need to have a say on that. The inclusion of new forms of poverty that are not new, but new to this kind of documents, such as the energy poverty. The inclusion also of some groups that are in special risk of poverty, such as children and young persons. And importantly, that inequalities are within and between countries. So that also calls for international reforms, for example, in the case of the international financial architecture that we discussed before in the panel. Yes, that's it. The third pillar is social protection and care. In the case of social protection, we can discuss further, but it calls for well-designed, sustainable, and efficient social protection systems that are responsive to shocks. It doesn't call for universality, but still we have that to work with. It calls for universal access to social protection. Yes, no. It calls for the elimination of hunger in armed conflicts by developing social protection systems, which is kind of very specific, but still we can like bring that out from social protection. And the role of science, technology, and innovation, again, in social protection. In this session, this one is quite interesting because it calls for the essential services for children. Again, it doesn't call for public services, but it's the first time that it links the public services with a right for social protection and young people's access to universal, adequate, comprehensive, sustainable, and nationally owned social protection systems, which I think it's quite interesting to explore that idea of nationally owned. And finally, on care, it calls for the closing of the gender gap, including in the care economy. What that means, that's an opportunity that we could leverage in the future just to further the care economy. And within the creation of decent jobs and livelihoods for young while dismantling inequalities in the care economy. Again, just the care economy, care is much broader than that as well. And as here my colleague said before, we need to go beyond GDP. What that means also, which is good for care, but it calls also for an idea, a collective idea of what putting care at the center of society and economy means in the future. And finally, in Action 6A, which I think is interesting, it calls for securing an ambitious outcome at the World Social Summit entitled Second World Summit for Social Development in 2025. But what I wanted to say today to you and actually learn from you is how does an ambitious outcome look like? It could look like several things, right? How do we ensure the agency of people within this ambitious outcome? Because we know that we need to raise money. We talked about long in the previous panel, but I think that is not enough just to raise money, right? We need to reimagine what we will do with that money. How do we spend that money, and what actually development means? Someone said this or asked this before in the previous panel. Because not for all of us, development means the same. So we need to look at how do we comply with common needs, but also with differentiated realities to ensure that we have a not colonized future. So what we wanted to do in the next part of the session is actually to, strategize on what we do now. So the time is now for us to say what we will do together and what we need to go, where we need to go, sorry, not to ask permission to go within the summit, but also to drive, to shape, and to push how this should look like. Our future, but also the summit itself. So are the three pillars that we need to be discussing today. So people-centered essential public services, technology and AI, multidimensional poverty, inequalities. The third one will be social policy and social protection with care economy. Those are the three that we will cover today. But the fourth one is the reform of international financial architecture and tax structures that we discussed in the previous panel, which are really in line with the outcomes of the FFD. So that will be a step towards the social summit as well. And we need to have that clear line of what we will do. So what we're seeking today is actually a commitment from all of us and a strategy of all of us on how we will do that in the future. But the future starts today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina, and thank you very much for everyone on the panel. Before we move to the next segment, I would like to invite Matthias from the International Society for Human Rights to give us a very quick intervention before we move into the discussion.
Thank you so much. Just a quick word and thanks for the great interventions. My name is Matthias Böning. I'm Secretary General of the International Society for Human Rights, and we are currently working with a very interesting partner, London-based, the Qatar Center for Peace and Democracy. It's the first ever, well, that in that sense, free and independent CSO that we also miraculously managed to get specially accredited for the Summit of the Future. There's a backstory to that that's quite interesting, but it happened, and the Qatar Center is very much interested on contributing to the preparation process to the World Social Summit, because there's always power and beauty in also localizing the topics for the very place we are meeting in. So there can be a power going out from what can be brought to Qatar in terms of civic space, in terms of labor rights and so on. So I really want to also interact with some of the speakers here on these topics. And then this can contribute to the messaging going out from the summit. So I wanted to let you know about this little piece of collaborative potential. And I'm happy to also be responding to questions and open for collaboration. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Yes, and actually we will take you up on that offer, and we are looking forward to hosting a youth summit or a youth assembly at in Qatar. So thank you. All right, so moving on to the next segment, I would like to invite Rosario and Valentina from the International Disability Alliance to have a discussion with the audience on the people-centered essential public services, technology, and artificial intelligence. I just want to announce that we have 2 other discussion groups. So we can take a few interventions for this one, and then we will move on to the next discussion for another like maybe 10 minutes. So Rosario and Valentina, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here representing the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities and the International Disability Alliance. This first pillar is really important for all groups, not only for persons with disabilities, but also for all the most marginalized groups, especially indigenous, people with different gender identities, LGBTI, and others. This first pillar is centered on people. People need to be the center of the essential public services. What this means? This means that definitely all the public services needs to be inclusive for everyone, which means that need to be not only accessible economically, it means affordable, but also need to be available, not only in the cities, need to be also in the rural areas. Need to be also affordable and also acceptable. It means that need to respect all the needs, need to respect the cultural diversity and respect the needs of the diverse groups. Also means that these services need to be adaptable. It means that everything needs to be adaptable to all needs of different persons from that diversity, not only persons with disabilities. In this case, we consider that definitely we need to be included in all policies, in all accessible services. If we want to address this widespread discrimination faced by all the most marginalized groups, we need definitely to have different policies that must be holistic, ambitious, and inclusive. We must focus on creating also people center public services, but also we need to participate since the beginning in the designing of technology, in the designing of artificial intelligence, because they can be really important for us to overcome these barriers, but at the same time, they can provide more barriers. That's why we need to be consulted since the beginning, and we need to be fully included and have meaningful participation. Now, in order to start this discussion, I would like to have some 4 questions that maybe you would like to reflect, and if any of you want to address the question, will be really great. The first is about what would be these key messages that we want to bring to this World Social Development, the World Summit. It's about these people need to be centered in essential public services, technology, and artificial intelligence. The second question would be, who do we want to influence and how? And the third question is interconnected with the second one because it's about who are the more important stakeholders nationally and internationally. And the fourth one is who or which organizations are going to do what. Please think carefully about these 4 questions. If you want to maybe answer one of these, we'll really pleased to hear from you. Valentina, if you want to add something?
Just a quick question. Also, how do we move towards caring services, right? So we can include women in the economy, which today is not accounted for. How do we do that, respecting all of the other characteristics of public services or how they should be done? If any of those ideas we can bring to the World Social Summit or Summit for Social Development, it would be really great. So we're taking words, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Lutfi. I'm the co-chair of the stakeholder group for persons with disabilities. But my professional background is that I am the director for capacity building and advocacy at the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs. Thank you for these questions. I will try to answer them, but I want to add also to some of the aspects that have been addressed by Rosario. I think one of the key messages that we have to communicate to the world is that technology is and digital inclusion and accessibility are matters of human rights. G3ICT, through its digital accessibility standardization and harmonization work group, has pushed very hard that disability has to be more included in the Global Digital Compact. We somehow succeeded by making sure that the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is explicitly mentioned in the compact as one of the human rights references. The only issue we have is that when we talk about accessibility, we have to be clear that accessibility does not mean that we want to make technology available only. Rosario mentioned the adaptability, but we have to be more elaborative when we address this, because one of the key things that we have to make sure that stakeholders are aware of is that we need to have standards that are recognized and complied with by all stakeholders in all countries. We are now conducting a survey to address this point, that we can also benefit from its outcomes for the discussion that will lead to the World Summit on social development. The thing is, one of the challenges we have witnessed is that there is a gap in dialogue between the private sector and organizations representing marginalized groups. Private sector wants to focus on income, marginalized groups want to focus on inclusion. So how do we bridge between the two? I think we need to establish a dialogue where we can bring together private sector who should become aware of or comply with the language of human rights, the rights to digital accessibility and inclusion, and on the same time, organizations representing marginalized groups need to have more effective and efficient messages to demand. I don't want to say that to convince, because it's not a matter of convincing, it's a matter of human rights. We're asking for our rights to be included in the private sector, to be offered employment opportunities, to have quality education, to have access to health care, and quality health care, not any health care. So we need to develop better messages, efficient messages, saying that it's human rights matters, right to digital accessibility matters, and also there's no harm of like saying the human rights or digital accessibility rights are impactful when it comes to economy, because we are increasing the level of capacity and production capacity in society by making sure that 16% of world population has their access to employment through technology. Thank you.
Okay. And then, okay, add it back.
Thank you. Just making an attempt to respond to the question of perhaps the most important stakeholder. I think the most important stakeholder are the communities, the people that we actually all work for. Unfortunately, these are being held hostage. I think one of the speakers did, speak quite a lot about, how elections are done and facet. And I think what we see now, people or the politicians stealing from the people in the name of having an election. It is a coup against the people. So what we're actually seeing in a number of countries, and especially in African countries across the Sahel belt, are people trying to reclaim what has been stolen from them. And this is what we call a coup. But in the first instance, the election itself was a coup against the people because it was stolen. So when we do have a coup, which is actually a result of work that, people's civic consciousness has been raised, their citizen agency is raised, and they actually want to have, to have their life back, then that is often defined as a coup, and then these countries, our countries, are put under sanctions. So I think as we try to define, what are the challenges that the social world faces, it's important to, first of all, really look at whether elections is not just a matter of ticking off a box, but in any case, in any case, it's delivering the democracy that we actually want.
Very much.
Thank you. I have been listening all of your speech. You are all amazing. but I think that it will be better if we make a plan, because so many members of NGOs and government organizations here, and so many representatives from many countries here. It is a chance, because every year we are gathering in many assemblies, in many events, and we are discussing the same things. I'm sure that the next year we will again gather, and we will again discuss about climate change, about the peace, about the drink, water, hungry, but it's the same things. In the other side, in one side we damage to nature, and in other side we ask for help to nature. In other side we climb for peace, but in other side we produce weapon and make war. In other side, we found out new planet, but we even so many years can't find even fresh drink in many places. Why? Maybe we are not enough interested in the solutions of these problems. Maybe we don't want to solve these problems really. I think that it is a chance now here to make a plan, real plan, what we can do. I just want action. I don't want to talk about the same things every year. Okay,
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we will have to move on to the next session. I know everyone has comments, and you know, we would like to contribute to the discussion. We're more than happy to take your inputs written, or chat with us during lunch. But food has arrived, so we have to get to the next session so that, you know, we start getting the food. If you're hungry, you know, or we can just skip the food. This segment, sorry. The next segment, I would like to invite Anne and Marianne. And Valentina and Arjun. Yes, Anna. Yes. We will have a conversation about the multidimensional poverty and inequalities, and also the social policy and social protection and care economy. Arjun.
Hi. Oh, sorry if that was too loud. So my name is Marianne Broxton. I'm part of the NGO CSOCD committee, and I'm also part of ATD Fourth World. And I want to talk to you about multidimensional poverty, because I think too much when we talk about poverty, we only look at the monetary standard, and we know it goes further beyond that. Example, the global line for poverty is $2.15. But if you have an empty stomach and you're sleeping on the street tonight, that does not mean you're out of poverty if you have $2.30 in your pocket. Multidimensional poverty includes everything from the resources to social and institutional maltreatment, the way people are treated. I greatly appreciated Paul earlier saying that we need to stop talking about people that are left behind. Because when we did, ATD Fourth World did a research project on it, and the report in the United States was named "Push to the Bottom," because that's the way a person that's directly impacted from poverty described their experience. They are constantly being pushed to the bottom. It means that your children aren't treated the same as their peers, as we know. Regardless if you have 3 or 4 part-time jobs, you will never get ahead. It's the way that society looks at you. All the different aspects that people can take pride in. The way I like to describe it is the social identity. If you are a Black trans woman with a disability, and you have the same, and you compared to a straight white male, they both have the same amount of money in their pocket, the same amount of money in their bank account, but the way society will treat that woman based on everything that's added can push them deeper into poverty and deeper into poverty by what they're denied. A right to legal identity in some places, rights to employment, to housing, to all of these different things that makes up multidimensional poverty. And I really think this is how we need to start looking at it, because we silo a lot. We talk about childcare, we talk about healthcare, we talk about women's rights, we talk about disability. All of it together is combined is what changes the person's experience of poverty. You know, whether you are at this level, under the table level, where and how harder it makes it for you to get out. I know we're short on time, and I don't want to, because I'm a fan of lunch, and I'm sure everybody here is too. And I want to give my fellow speakers a chance, but I would be happy to talk to you about it afterwards.
Yes, I think I will make it very quick, and then also ask for your ideas, because I mean that's actually what we want to do. I want to bring one aspect that hasn't been mentioned yet. When it comes to people with disabilities, often the poverty line is just based on income. But when a person with disability needs assistive technology to maybe be able to get somewhere to have transportation, to go to work, to go to school or something like that, the costs are very, very high. And so often it is not taken into account that a person with a disability has way more expenses just to be able to participate in society. And that's something that really needs to be taken into account when we talk about poverty. So I just wanted to emphasize on that and stop here and ask you to maybe give a few insights or ideas what we really should focus on. And I would also like to suggest maybe let's talk about this when we eat, and also if you really want to join our advocacy efforts towards the World Social Summit, that we just, I don't know, make some kind of list or something that we really get together and have a conversation after this, because it's just too, it's not enough time today. Yeah.
Should I go? Thank you very much, Anne. My name is Sylvia Beals, and I'm a member of the global what do we call it? Coalition for Social Protection Floors, a founder member. And a key area, as we know, is the lack of ring fencing in any form of social programming in, you know, since Copenhagen. Even though Copenhagen was a very clear signal to the importance of financial investment in this area, as well as the political will and human rights dimensions of that, as we have heard. So I wanted basically just to remind you that if we do not get the ring-fenced funding for social protection, for health, for housing, for transport, for all the things that we know people both have a right to and require to live a dignified life. Inclusion is expensive, it was said today. It's also politically expedient not to ring fence it. So we have to be mindful of this as we go to Qatar. And I want to ask my colleague Valentina, who works on care, and also we have a friend at the back here, Barry, who works on finance, to, if they can, just say a few words about the challenge we face on the, I think, the financing, but also our collective will to put in place what is agreed, the social protection floors, universal social protection floors. 50% of the world don't have them. I mean, you know, it's absolutely unacceptable. But I do want to point, as Ingo said at the beginning, the modalities resolution for the World Social Summit says specifically that the list of people allowed to go will include proposed as well as final names. I am now reading. The general basis of any objections, if requested by one or more states, members of the United Nations, or state members of the specialized agencies, will be made known to the office of the President of the General Assembly and the requester. We have a job to do to get there. So we have a lot of strategizing to do to make sure not just our positioning is coordinated and clear, but that we can be there. And I also have my friend Arjun from Nepal, who might say a few words, but we're a bit stuck for time. So I'd like to ask Valentina to just say a little bit about CARE. It's expensive, underfunded, and it is the engine of what helps communities function. So it's a really important issue and we have to get around it. Thank you, Valentina. And then after that, perhaps you could ask Barry and Arjun to say a few words.
I will say something really quickly because I already talked too much, but I think here we have the opportunity to give meaning to what care means. For us in Latin America, it's really a relating issue because the concept from the side of the world. Currently, there is an advisory opinion at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regarding the extent of the human right to care, which is like to be cared, to care for others, and to self-care, including, for example, from the civil society perspective, reproductive autonomy, environmental care, community care, and the link of care as an enabler of other economic, social, and cultural rights. But at the international level, there's also meanings, are discussions around the care work, the care economy, and the care society. So if we are going to move on to the summit to include care, how are we going to do? How are we going to, what concept are we going to mobilize? So we have to have the discussion, maybe we can have it around lunch, but also to start developing this kind of content in normative terms, but also in political terms.
So can I just ask Barry to say a few words? I want to introduce Barry Herman. He's a member of our Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, and he always injects very important realism into our discussions on finance. So thank you, Barry.
Okay, so, well, thank you. And hello all. So the first thing about realism on finance is there's not going to be any money coming out of the World Social Summit. That is to say, countries may promise to make great efforts to increase their funding, but it's don't hold your breath. From our perspective as the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, we are about advocacy. And the way you get social protection is you have a social movement in countries that become politically powerful enough to get the money. So, for example, one of our, we're going to come out with a paper soon about South Africa by a member of the coalition from South Africa that says that, for example, in their arguments with the International Monetary Fund about austerity and so on, the fund has actually said to them, okay, you want to spend more money on social protection? Tell us what you're going to cut. You don't have to cut the social spend, you can cut something else. Oh, okay, I mean, you can't say that's wrong. The IMF is there telling them, yes, this is a political struggle. You have to struggle. And we are, in fact, one of the things that's being done in the coalition is a campaign on Social Security, where there'll be several country studies about how these advocacy efforts are being done. So I think the best that could come out of the social summit would be some impetus to organizing at national level as well as international level, but the words that come out of these conferences are less important than the political momentum that can come out. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much. I'm being told we have to wrap up, but we haven't had a chance for the discussion. I mean, is it all right, Rose, if we take a couple of comments or not, or do we do it over lunch? We do it over lunch. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming. It's a great meeting. What we're going to do is put a sheet out. Please write your names on it if you want to be part of this movement towards the social summit, strategizing, movement, thoughts.